Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 6 of our Secure AI series. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the Copilot. Okay, so this is almost a sum up from our previous episodes, right? When we talk about DLP, we talk about labeling. Okay, we're actually going to see it in action. Okay, so what I've done is I've spun up my own tenant and I have my own environment, right? And I'm using Copilot and I'm prompting Copilot, right, with DLP controls and labeling controls in the background. Okay, and the purpose of this episode is to see how security should behave when a user is interacting with Copilot. Okay, when a user is uploading a document to Copilot that's correctly labeled or is protected by a label, right? And Copilot should basically respond in the appropriate manner. Okay, whether it summarizes it, whether it doesn't summarize it. Okay, it's all to do with how your tenant and how your environment is set up from a security perspective. Because the biggest takeaway is that Copilot is just a catalyst. Okay, whatever a user can do, Copilot can do. Okay, it's not here to break anything. It's only going to expose poor security controls that you might have in place as an organization. Okay, so with that being said, the agenda, as per usual, we're going to talk about the architecture because I think that's really important. Okay, there's a lot of information out there about Copilot this, Copilot that, AI this, AI that, but what is the actual beast that we're talking about? Okay, and how does it work? Okay, and the biggest learning that I hope you take away from this video is that you'll understand how Copilot for M365 actually interacts with your graph APIs and with your overall tenant. Okay, why protection matters for Copilot, and then security lessons and a real world demo as well that we'll be showing you at the very end of this episode. So we'll kick it off. Okay, so how does Copilot actually work? Now, this image can be quite intimidating to a lot of people, but it's actually quite simple, right? When you break it down, right? So if we follow the path, right? If we look at point one, right? User sends a prompt, right? Fairly simple. Okay, it could be anything. It could be summarize this document, asking you the question, right? Whatever the prompt is. And now the really cool thing about Copilot, right, is that it's one of the very few LLMs out there, right, is that it has a pre-processing and a post-processing. Okay, so when you're looking at your pre-processing, right, this is when Copilot grounds and it accesses your graph, right, and you can, depending on what plugins you have, you can link it to the web, you can ground it to just your tenant so that it's not influenced by web decisions. There's no and also that reduces hallucination as well. It just depends on how you guys want to set it up in your own organization. Okay, but what happens is it's basically reaching into your tenant from that prompt, and it could be, all right, summarize this meeting. Okay, it's going to reach into the team's transcripts. It's going to have context and sort of understand what it is that you want to pull it from, whether it's a meeting you've just had or a previous meeting that you've just had, right, as long as the transcription is on. But once that grounding is done and once it's accessed, right, your Microsoft Graph, it then goes, right, as point three highlights here, it actually sends that prompt to its LLM. Okay, so the LLM, right, the large language model, there's three very important points. Okay, so we'll just talk about them very briefly, right? The first point here is that prompts and responses and even grounded data, they're not used to train. Okay, so models aren't being trained with Copilot M365. Okay. Another point, obviously, we all know Copilot and OpenAI have, or Microsoft, I should say, and OpenAI have signed an agreement, a commercial agreement, right? So they're very in bed with each other. But the most important thing to note is that Azure OpenAI, it's owned by Microsoft. Okay, so OpenAI, they don't have access to your data, right? That's something that I think a lot of people are kind of confused about because you look at Sam Altman and Satya, and you're wondering, oh, like is my data now being owned by OpenAI? So Microsoft promised their customers, right, that your data is in the Microsoft 365 service boundary. Okay, and then we have RAI, right? So RAI is responsible AI, and that's just making sure that when Copilot sends back the response right before it hits the post processing, it's not including profanity or inappropriate words. Okay, so the cool thing about Copilot is that Microsoft have inbuilt guardrails. Okay, so even if you had no security in place, right, you're not able to find stuff like salary information, personal information about certain employees, etc. So that's already built into the model, right? But your post processing, which again is kind of what we're talking about for all of this series, is your compliance and your purview controls. Okay, so that's your DLP, that's your labeling. Okay, so that's when it accesses your graph again for your whatever security controls you have in place. So if you don't have good security, okay, it's just going to behave like it would normally. Okay, it's not going to stop and say, oh yeah, I'm not going to summarize this really sensitive document because it's super sensitive. Copilot doesn't know that unless you classify it as a sensitive document via a label, or you protect the information in that document via a DLP policy. Okay, so that's what we were talking about in the previous episodes and why it's so important as well. Another thing you probably all notice is that we have Claude on the outside here of the M365 boundary. So again, not just Claude, but Gemini and other third-party AI tools, they don't share the same architecture as Copilot. Okay, from a security perspective, Copilot M365 is by far the leading LLM. Right, it's the leading AI tool. It is integrated into your tenants, it's integrated into your graph. Right, so especially if you want to build agents, right, in Copilot Studio, right, and you're using an external tool, trying to secure that can be a nightmare, to be honest. Okay, so what Microsoft has done is they've done a very good job of making sure that all of your data is within that service boundary. Okay, and again, it's not to put down other models like Claude or OpenAI or Gemini, and they're great. They have their purposes. Okay, especially for coding, Claude is very, very good. But it's just understanding when you're dealing with customer data, these third-party AI tools are far behind Copilot from a security perspective. Okay, so that's something to note. And I guess, on security, why do we need to secure AI, right? So obviously built-in guardrails, they're not enough. Okay, so I know I talked about how Copilot has built-in guardrails, and you might be thinking, oh, that's great. I don't need to secure Copilot then. Unfortunately, that's wrong. Okay, so it has baseline protections, right? But when it comes to your customer data, your HR records, it still relies on your organization's security and compliance, okay, to define what's sensitive. And it's up to you, it's up to your IT team, it's up to your cybersecurity team to tell Copilot, right, using Purview, right, as the main data governance tool, what is sensitive and what isn't sensitive, okay? And again, kind of leading on to point two, right, context can always be lost in automation, right? So any AI model will always respond to intent, right, not governance. So if you don't have proper DLP controls or policy in place, data, it can be moved beyond, right, its intended boundaries through various, right, methods, whether it's, prompt injections, or if you want to summarize chat to generate content and then you want to export that. There's a cool thing about Copilot where it has inheritance. Right now, you need to set it up, right, from a security perspective. But inheritance essentially means that if you have a label, right, and you have it confidential, right, and you label a document confidential, and you ask Copilot to summarize that document, right, assuming that in the confidential encryption, Copilot can access that, right? You ask Copilot to summarize that document. You then ask Copilot to make a new document based on the contents of the confidential document. That new document that Copilot will make will also be labeled confidential, right? And that's really, really important to note, right? Especially for point three, right? Because if we're being honest, and this stems from the MIT report as well, 95% of Gen AI projects fail. The 5% that do succeed will only work if there's governance in place, right? They'll only scale if your data remains protected. Okay, so with that strong governance, we ensure that leadership and different stakeholders and even your customers can trust AI outputs. Okay, I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with the Australian case with Deloitte recently, right, where Deloitte messed up a massive report for the Australian government and now have to pay a hefty sum, and even just the reputational damage, it's awful, right? So we have to make sure that customers, whether we're an individual, whether we're an organization, whether we're doing it for organizations, customers can trust that their data is secure, and then that leads to adoption. Okay, security should be done in the back end. Okay, it's a very important process, right? But we shouldn't be putting that burden on people wondering in the back of their minds when they're using an AI tool like Copilot. I wonder, is this, can I use this? Is my data okay? Like, we should be teaching Copilot to label and not label, and summarize and not summarize what is sensitive and what isn't sensitive. And more importantly, making sure that our users have a smooth experience with Copilot. Okay. And that again leads to the whole security and adoption that come hand in hand. And again, we'll do a different episode about that as well, because I think it's very important. Okay. And the final point, labeling and DLP. Okay. Security, we can talk about a plethora of things, right, when it comes to securing AI and Copilot, whether it's identity, whether it's your XDR, your threat protection, right? There's so much we can talk about. In this episode, right, I want to link the previous learnings that we've had with labeling, with DLP, and why they matter for AI, okay? So pretty much summing up what I've already said, right? Define what Copilot can and can't access, okay? With sensitivity labels, we can identify what data is confidential, right, and what Copilot only retrieves, right? Again, going back to the pre-processing and the post-processing, okay, your pre-processing, right, is just telling Copilot what you want it to do. The post-processing, right, is what you have set up as an organization, okay? And Copilot will only behave based on what guardrails you put around it, right, for certain information, okay? And again, when you're defining and publishing security policies or labels, we know that we can connect the DLP policy with a label and vice versa, right? So Copilot will respond to that, ensuring that you have a holistic compliance and protection within your organization. Okay, and then of course, like anything with security, we can integrate and optimize. Okay, so every interaction with Copilot with a label data or with a DLP policy, it's logged, it's traceable, it's in your audit log. Okay, and that's really important to note, because with Purview, right, we don't want to shut things down. We want to control it, but we also want to move forward. We want to view our data. We want to view our interactions and adjust and adapt, right? Because the way AI is going, it's changing constantly. Okay, and the idea as an organization and security is that we can adapt and we can view and we can adjust policies if we need to adjust, right? But we don't want to shut everything down and block everything at a network level. We want to be able to use AI securely. We want to be able to not have FOMO. We want to be able to give our users the ability and confidence, right, to use enterprise AI tools like Copilot, okay? Because according to the MIT report as well, 90% of users, right, are using shadow AI, right? So they're using Claude, they're using ChatGPT, they're using other AI tools that just aren't secure. So what organizations often do is they'll block it at a network level, right? But then what users might do is that they'll just bring their own devices, or they'll export customer data onto their own Gmails and then use their own laptops to summarize it, because users always take the path of least resistance, right? So we want to enable users, right, to do their job effectively, to use AI, because at the end of the day, guys, users are going to use AI because they see the benefits. It makes their job easier. It makes their job more efficient, right? So it's not fair, especially with Gen Z, right, and the younger generation who have basically grown up with AI in college, right? As an organization, if you're hiring them and then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, we don't use AI, they're going to question it. They're going to be very, very confused, and of course, they're going to find their own methodologies to make their life easier, right? And that's when they're looking at external AI tools that aren't secure. Okay, so the idea is that we can put proper guardrails around Copilot so that we can then enable our users, right, to work more efficiently and more securely, right? And that's the whole purpose, right, of securing AI. Okay, guys, so here we are in our demo environment. Okay, so it's a pre-recorded video that I've done on my own tenant. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click through the video just to get to the meat and bones of it, okay, and kind of ignore all the stuff that isn't really relevant. But the idea is seeing how good security controls should interact, right, with an LLM like Copilot, right? Copilot M365 that is built into our tenant, right, that will just behave based on our purview and compliance controls. Okay, so with that being said, we'll just kick it off. So I've just paused it here, guys, right? So here is the document that I've uploaded, okay? So document protected from Copilot, no DLP, okay? And I've summarized it here. This document is protected by a label, right? Please summarize or please tell me what's in the document, okay? Now, because we've configured this label so that if stuff is labeled Copilot shouldn't be able to interact with it, right? If we look at our previous episode, episode 5, when we look at the copy and extract feature, right, I've turned that feature off for this label, which means that Copilot should not be able to access this. Okay, so again, to summarize, this is an example of when we're using classification to protect our documents, to protect our files from Copilot. Okay, and again, it could be super sensitive documents that we want nobody to be able to summarize using Copilot, etc. So it really depends on your appetite as an organization. But we'll just have a look at Copilot's response here. Okay, and I'll pause it here. So look, this document titled Document Protection from Copilot and DLP is protected and does not allow access to its contents. Okay, the only message available is can't provide more information as the result is protected. Okay, now Copilot will give you some reasoning as well, which means that the document is secured by a label or some form of encryption that restricts access even for summarizations. Okay, so that's really important to note. And again, this is when we configure a label correctly. Okay, so the reason that we look at episode 5, when we look at the permission features of a label, right, and we can see everything, is that I am a user that has access to this label, and hence the way I've configured this label, Copilot behaves accordingly. Okay, again, it's not here to break anything, it's only behaving based on your security controls. Okay, so what we're going to look at next is a document being protected by DLP. Okay, not just a label, because as I said before, labels can be configured incorrectly. There's a lot to them. You have to publish them to the right users, etc. So DLP can be a nice alternative, right, to protect information, right, if you're not confident that your label setup is appropriate for AI usage. Okay, so I'll just pause it here again. Okay, so what we have here is a general document protected by DLP from Copilot. Okay, so this document has no label protection and is protected by DLP. Please summarize. Okay, now an important point to note here, guys, is general document. Okay, so I've used a general label, right, which in theory, right, by default, Copilot can summarize documents that have a general label on them, because when we look at the encryption settings on the general label, we have the copy and extract. It's very, very unrestricted, right? Because it's a general label, it's for general usage. Okay, so in theory, this should, summarize the document. However, we've added it into our DLP policy. So regardless, even if the label is configured to be super, super permissive, right? Because we added it into our DLP policy that will block a label, regardless of how the label is configured from Copilot, Copilot should not be able to access this document. So let's have a look at the response. All right, and I'll pause it again. So again, this document titled General Document Protected by DLP from Copilot is protected by your organization's data loss prevention policies, okay? So it can't provide more information in accordance with your organization's security policies. So again, we see our DLP working. We see our labels working, okay? Now, as the series progresses, I'll show everyone how to configure this, how to configure a DLP policy to protect information from Copilot. We've already had a taste of how you can properly configure a label, right, and protect your documents from Copilot as well. But I just wanted to tie it all together, right, in terms of what we should be seeing and how we should be interacting with our LLM, okay, and how it should be behaving as well, okay. Okay, guys, that's it for episode 6. Again, it's just to show off at a very high level, right, how our data, right, whether it's protected by a DLP policy or it's protected by a label, right, should be protected from an LLM like Copilot. Now, again, Microsoft have done a great job with their pre-processing and post-processing and just keeping it in that service boundary, okay, from a security perspective. But we always have to do more as security professionals, right? And make sure that we give our users the confidence, right, to use enterprise AI tools like Copilot, and we give our customers the confidence and the trust to know that their data is protected, whether it's internal or external. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.